The Mpumalanga government, of course, are talking about the fact that procurement processes were flawed in the buying of 22 laptops by the province's education department, and also speaking about how some of the officials themselves were in fact working with the service providers, it seems, in order to be able then to finalize some of the processes, simply not even cross-checking to see if what they had ordered was in fact what was delivered, and also looking at the fact that now you've got procurement processes that are being brought into question. Just how far and wide does this now raise alarm bells for the provincial government to say that they need to possibly start investigating some of the procurement processes? Where do they begin in order to start to ensure that they tighten some of their processes? Let's have this discussion now. We'll speak to Mpumalanga Provincial Government spokesperson George Mthethwa. George, good evening to you, and thank you so much for your time. This is absolutely shocking, and I remember that when the story first came about, a lot of people were shocked as to how much do you need to, really just, steal here, if I can even put it that way, because you're saying that laptops are costing 2 million rand, 91,000 rand each. Did the accounting officer in the investigation say how this was allowed to happen?
Well, good evening to you, Bongiwe, and good evening to the viewers. Good to have you on your show. Well, I think by now we know, it's public knowledge, that indeed the Premier made a commitment that an investigation should actually be conducted so that we determine and verify the information that has been lying out there in the public, with all sorts of conspiracy theories suggesting that the procurement process, actually a certain amount of money was used, and also citing some officials in one way or another. Now, today, as you correctly pointed out, the Premier actually outlined the outcome of the investigation, of the report that was compiled, so that it gives us the findings of what actually happened in the process. Well, we can confirm by now that indeed the process for the acquisition of the 22 laptops was flawed because it violated the applicable legislation relating to the procurement of goods and services within government. Now, straight to your question, what are the steps that will be taken? I think the Premier has already entrenched that understanding.
Pardon me, George, pardon me. The question is, what about the processes allowed for this to happen? Not what's going to happen. What about the processes did you find out made it possible for them to do this?
Well, we can confirm, based on the outcome of the investigation, that there's been collusion between the service provider who was actually appointed to undertake this process of delivering the 22 laptops and the printer. So there has been findings to that effect, that indeed the officials, some officials within the Department of Education colluded with the supplier to the extent that the supplier was allowed to deliver laptops that are not in accordance with the specification that was issued by the department, by the various bids committees, as approved by the HOD.
So, George, when you look at the Premier's statement, I'm going to borrow some of what it says, right? He says that certain officials acted in a grossly dishonest manner. I suppose they lied. They conducted a departmental investigation into a matter in which they were implicated. They failed to make a full disclosure of their own involvement and provided incorrect information during departmental investigation. They misled both the Premier and the MEC by providing inaccurate information during the departmental investigation. And then the service provider acted in a grossly dishonest manner when attempting to cover up its failures to comply with his agreed specifications. One would ask, I see that the Premier's statement is talking about recovering some of the monies here and possibly maybe at a later stage to report to the SAPS any possible criminal acts. Is there no sufficient evidence right now when you look at the fact that people lied, they colluded, this is corruption? Should there be no criminal case opened already?
Well, your question is very good. I think the Premier has already intimated to that effect, that indeed the consequences for those who are implicated in this process of the acquisition of the laptops will be such that where there is a necessity to actually take drastic steps, such as reporting the case to the SABC, that will actually be done. And the Premier has also committed that indeed disciplinary action within the department, of course supported by the Office of the Premier, will actually be instituted.
So, George,
but the issue of criminal charges, can I just finish this point? The issue of criminal charges, the Premier has not ruled it out. In other words, there is still room for criminal charges to be pressed against those who are actually implicated.
I get that, but watching the briefing earlier, this is where the point of dissatisfaction is, right? Is that, as you say tonight, that if it needs to get to that drastic action of taking people to the police, these are people who lied. When you read the Premier's statement, they lied, they colluded, they defrauded the department, in order to be able to get all of this, as per the statement of the Premier. So it's not even a drastic step, because they drastically did what is supposed to not have been done, which is to steal. Now, you then are saying it's a drastic, and should it come to that, is it not enough that they defrauded the department, that this should be the natural step that follows, not a possible step?
Well, firstly, what we have done now, Bongwe, is that we have actually taken the steps of ensuring that we piece together every piece of evidence that we needed to gather. Because remember, the point of reference for this investigation was such that we needed to get evidence. Remember, these were conspiracy theories and all sorts of information, strewn in all various media platforms. Of course, there was information that was also provided by the whistleblower, as the Premier indicated. However, given the nature of the information that it was, strewn all over, the Premier then took this decision that let's rather have an investigation that will actually piece together the information, get the documents that will assist the investigation, so that we are able to make that determination. So you always want to make sure that you cover every aspect, so that the moment you start taking steps such as also taking the matter to the police, all areas are covered, so that even the investigation itself by the police or any other agency can actually be tied. So the question as to is it not enough? Well, we can make that determination that it is enough evidence that charges can then be pressed for criminal investigation to be undertaken by the South African Police Services, and of course all other agencies that are actually responsible, have the mandate, of course, of investigating such cases.
So, George, briefly, we're out of time. How concerned is the Premier, though, that maybe this might be a picture that's replicated in other departments? How will he tighten the controls here to prevent this again?
Well, two responses to your question. The first one is that the step that has been taken by the Premier since this matter, was reported or was brought to his attention, is such that there is a commitment from the part of the provincial government to entrench the priorities of the 7th administration, of which one of them is the development, in fact, the building of a capable and ethical, and I emphasize the part of the ethical, because that's exactly what the Premier also emphasized, the part of the ethical and developmental state, which simply means if there are allegations of this nature, they must actually be investigated thoroughly to make sure that those who are implicated in any wrongdoing, punitive measures can then be instituted against them. Right. Now, what is it going to be done to make sure that in case if you have similar cases rearing an ugly head in other departments, sorry for that, for my lighting, it does go off, sorry about that.
I thought it was load shedding.
Yeah, not at all. Well, the Premier is actually committed to run a clean government. And that actually came out when he was addressing the media briefing today. So there are steps that have been taken to make sure that we don't have a similar occurrence in other departments. There's a team that has been established provincially, which will be assisted by the provincial treasury. These are, officials who are quite expert on financial management.
Okay.
We're going to make sure that the issues around financial management and internal controls are actually attended to. Where there are weaknesses in the system, they are also going to detect that and make sure that those internal weaknesses are strengthened so that you close every loophole that might exist that may give rise to similar undesirable behavior from public servants.
George, I appreciate your time this evening. And as the Premier says that there will be ongoing report backs on this particular matter, let's see then what another installment then has for us. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. That was Mpumalanga Provincial Government spokesperson George Mthethwa.